The morning began with a metallic taste of copper coating the back of my throat. It was Monday, a day that should have been defined by the mundane, rhythmic rituals of a city awakening, but the atmosphere felt fundamentally fractured. As I stepped out of my apartment, the air didn't hit me with a breeze. It pressed against me with a sudden, suffocating density. It was a heavy, slate-gray humidity that smelled of ozone and wet pavement, the kind of air that clings to your skin like a damp burial shroud. I walked toward the subway station, my footsteps echoing against the brick walls of the alleyway with a lonely, hollow finality. Thud. Pause. Thud. Normally, this street was a cacophony of urban life, the rhythmic clatter of trash cans, the distant, muffled shouting of vendors, the impatient, staccato honking of taxis. But today, the city was whispering in a language of silence. I reached the turnstile and fumbled for my transit card. My fingers felt clumsy, thick, and numb with a phantom cold that seemed to radiate from the concrete floor. As I reached down to retrieve the dropped card from the dirty linoleum, I saw a pair of shoes standing just inches from my hand. They were black, polished to a mirror finish, and perfectly, unnervingly still. I felt a natural, lifelong impulse to look up, to offer a quick, apologetic sorry to the stranger I was obstructing. But my neck stiffened. A primal, lizard-brain instinct screamed at me to stay down. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor. I watched a discarded candy wrapper tumble slowly across the tiles, driven by a draft that felt like the last, cold breath of a dying beast. I grabbed my card and stood up, but I kept my chin tucked firmly into the collar of my heavy coat, my eyes locked onto the scuff marks on the station floor. I boarded the 8:12 train. The doors hissed shut, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to slice the world in two, sealing us inside a pressurized tube of steel and dread. I found a seat in the corner of the car. The plastic bench was freezing, the chill seeping through my trousers and into my flesh. I sat there, clutching my leather briefcase to my chest like a shield, and that's when the realization truly began to settle into my marrow. The silence in the train car was surgical. It wasn't the comfortable, bored silence of people lost in their own thoughts or buried in their smartphones. It was a disciplined, terrified stillness. There were 24 people in that car, and not a single one of them was looking at another. They were all staring at the horizon, or rather, a point exactly 3 inches above the shoulder of the person sitting across from them. I felt a bead of cold sweat prickle at my hairline, slowly tracing a path down my temple. I could hear the mechanical hum of the train's motor, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my very teeth. To my right sat an elderly man in a tweed coat. I could hear his breathing, shallow, jagged, and desperate. I felt the radiating heat from his arm, only inches from mine, yet he felt miles away. Every fiber of my social upbringing, every year of human evolution, urged me to acknowledge him. A nod, a glance, a shared moment of commuter exhaustion. I began to tilt my head, just a fraction of a degree. Suddenly, a hand, firm, cold, and smelling of sharp lavender soap, pressed against my chin from behind. It was gentle but unyielding, forcing my gaze back toward the scratched, grimy window of the train. "Don't," a woman's voice whispered directly into my ear. It was a flat, toneless sound, devoid of any human inflection, which made it feel like a final judgment. "Look at the ads on the wall, Elias. Look at the emergency brake. Look at the dirt under your fingernails. But do not look at him. Do not look at anyone." The hand vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving a lingering chill on my skin. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that seemed loud enough to fill the entire car. "Why?" I screamed internally, my thoughts racing in a panicked circle. What happens if I look? Is it a law? A virus? A predatory god? I did as I was told. I stared at a faded advertisement for a dental clinic. I memorized the artificial curvature of the printed teeth, the chipped blue ink of the phone number, the way the plastic cover was peeling at the corners. I became a scholar of the mundane, because the alternative felt like staring directly into a solar eclipse. I watched the reflections in the dark glass as the train hurtled through the subway tunnel. Even there, in the distorted, flickering images, people were careful. They tilted their heads down, pulling their hoods low, letting their hair drape like curtains over their faces. They weren't just avoiding eye contact. They were hiding their very identity from a threat I couldn't yet name. The train slowed, the brakes screeching with a metallic agony that set my nerves on fire. We pulled into the station. The doors opened with that same dying hiss. We shuffled out in a rhythmic, mechanical line. No one said, "Excuse me," when a shoulder brushed mine. No one held the door. We moved like a school of fish, guided by an invisible, silent current of fear, our eyes fixed on the pavement, the scuffed heels of the person in front of us, or the distant, gray skyline. As I climbed the stairs to the street level, the air grew even colder, smelling of old stone and stagnant water. I passed a fountain in the plaza. A child, no older than 5, was standing by the water. In his innocence, his head began to tilt upward. He began to turn his face toward a passing cyclist, his eyes wide with a curiosity that had not yet been broken by the rules of this new world. I saw his mother's movement. It was a flash of desperate, violent speed. She grabbed the boy's head, her fingers digging into his soft cheeks with enough force to leave bruises, and she slammed his face down into the fabric of her coat. She didn't scold him. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, her body trembling with a visible, bone-deep terror, until the boy went limp in her arms, submitting to the new geometry of the street. I reached the lobby of my office building. The massive glass doors reflected a sea of bowed heads, hundreds of people moving in a silent, synchronized dance of avoidance. I realized then that I wasn't just afraid of what would happen if I looked at someone else. I was terrified of what I would see looking back at me from the void behind their eyes. I stepped into the elevator. The doors began to close, and for a split second, I saw a man standing in the back corner. He was facing the wall, and he was laughing, a silent, shoulder-shaking laugh that produced no sound at all. I looked at the floor. I looked at the buttons. I looked at the light. "Please," I prayed to the silent elevator. "Don't let me look." By noon, the office had transformed into a complex architectural labyrinth of sharp angles and forbidden zones. My cubicle, once a mundane sanctuary of productivity, now felt like a tiny raft drifting in a vast, frozen, and wordless ocean. I sat at my desk, my fingers gripping the edges of the keyboard so tightly that my knuckles turned the color of bone. My eyes were locked onto the flickering cursor on my monitor. Blink, pause, blink. The bluish light of the screen felt like a physical weight pressing against my retinas, burning a rectangle of emptiness into my vision, but I did not dare turn away. The soundscape of the office had undergone a surgical transformation. The low hum of the air conditioning and the dry clatter of keys remained, but the human noises, the warmth of laughter near the coffee machine, the rhythmic whisper of gossip, even the heavy sighs of midday exhaustion, had been removed like a malignant tumor. My colleagues moved through the hallways like ghosts. I could hear the rustle of their clothes and the soft squeak of rubber soles on carpet, but those sounds were always retreating. No one approached. No one stopped. I needed to leave my desk. A simple trip to the restroom now felt like navigating a minefield under the gaze of invisible snipers. I rose slowly, keeping my eyes anchored to the fibrous texture of the gray carpet. I began to notice details I had ignored for years. The interlocking weave of the synthetic threads, a tiny coffee stain near the printer that looked like a distorted map of an unknown country. I walked along the wall, feeling the cold drywall against my shoulder, counting every step. 1, 2, turn. In the hallway, I felt the presence of someone else approaching. It was my supervisor, Mr. Henderson. Previously, he had been the embodiment of loud, boisterous confidence, a man who demanded firm handshakes and a direct, drilling gaze. Now, he was a shadow of his former self. He walked with his chin tucked deeply into his chest, staring at his own shoes with an intensity that suggested his very survival was encoded in the leather. As we passed each other, the air between us seemed to thicken and vibrate. It was a physical sensation, a high-frequency tension, as if two magnets with the same pole were being forced together by a giant hand. My neck muscles cramped with the effort of looking down. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth began to ache. We passed without exchanging even a microscopic gesture of recognition. We were two strangers sharing the same catastrophe in total isolation. I pushed open the heavy door to the restroom. It gave way with a silent, oily groan. Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of bleach and stagnant water. I walked to the sink, staring exclusively at the chrome faucet, where a single drop of water was slowly swelling, heavy with gravity. And it was here that I made the mistake. It was a small action, a split-second flash of a 20-year habit that had been forged in a world that no longer existed. I lifted my head and looked into the mirror. At first, I saw only myself. My face looked haggard, my skin the color of wet newsprint, with dark, bruised circles carved under my eyes. But then, in the depths of the reflection behind me, I saw the gap of a partially open stall door. Inside that stall, a man was standing. He wasn't sitting. He was standing on the toilet seat itself, facing the door, looming over the partition. My breath hitched in my throat, escaping as a ragged, sharp sound that cracked like a gunshot in the tiled room. I didn't see his eyes directly, but I felt them. In the mirror, I could see the edge of his forehead and a shock of unkempt hair, but I knew, I felt it in the marrow of my spine, that his gaze was fixed directly onto the back of my skull through the silvered glass. This man wasn't hiding. He was waiting. He stood in absolute stillness, like a predator that had just heard the click of a trap. I snapped my head down so violently I felt something pop in my vertebrae, and the world blurred into a dark smear. My hands shook so intensely I could barely grip the handle of the faucet. I splashed ice-cold water onto my face, but I kept my eyes closed. I couldn't look up. Every nerve ending in my body was screaming, if you see him in the mirror, he becomes real. If your gazes meet through the glass, the connection is forged. And then, he will come out. I backed out of the restroom, not stopping to dry my hands, feeling the icy water trickling down the back of my shirt. My heart thundered against my ribs like a panicked prisoner. I nearly ran through the corridor back to my desk, feeling a cold, heavy weight of attention pressing against my shoulder blade. As I slumped back into my chair, I realized one thing. The rule wasn't just a matter of social etiquette or a strange mass hysteria. It was a survival mechanism. In this city, in the very shadows between our lives, something new had arrived. Something that fed on recognition. It lived in that brief, flickering moment when one human being acknowledges the existence of another. I looked at my computer screen. A new email had arrived. The sender was marked only as anonymous. The subject line consisted of 4 words. Do not blink. Look down. I opened it. There was no text. Only a single, high-resolution photograph. It was a human eye. The image was so detailed I could see the tiny red capillaries on the white and the jagged, irregular edges of the pupil. But the terror lay in the reflection on the cornea of that eye. In that tiny, convex mirror, I saw my room, my office, and in the center of the frame, standing directly behind my chair, was a figure that had no face. It was a mass of shifting, gray static, only vaguely resembling a man. It just stood there, in my personal space, while all my colleagues diligently studied their mousepads. I didn't turn around. I didn't move. I simply stared at the cursor, which continued to blink in the void. Blink. Pause. Blink. The office was silent. No one looked at each other. And now I understood why. We weren't just avoiding each other's eyes. We were afraid to confirm that there was no longer anyone left behind them to look back. The email vanished from my screen as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the stark, familiar desktop wallpaper, a bland, corporate landscape of rolling green hills. But the image of the faceless, static man, standing behind my chair in the reflection of an eye, was burned into my retina. I could still see it when I closed my eyes, a shimmering afterimage against the blackness. My breathing was shallow, ragged, barely disturbing the air around me. I felt a cold, prickling sensation spread across my scalp, as if every hair were standing on end. My hands were clammy, cold, yet my back was drenched in a film of nervous sweat. The office, once a place of predictable routine, now felt like a pressurized chamber, every silence loaded with potential catastrophe. What was that thing? My mind screamed, but the question dissolved into a shapeless dread. Was it a prank? A virus? Or was it real? I didn't dare turn around. The idea of confirming its presence felt like signing my own death warrant. So I remained, a statue of terrified compliance, staring at my monitor, willing the image to disappear. My peripheral vision, usually a reliable ally, was now a source of torment. Every flicker of light, every shadow cast by a passing colleague, made my heart lurch. I imagined the gray static figure shifting, taking a step closer, its non-face tilting in silent contemplation of the back of my head. The afternoon dragged on with a geological slowness. The sunlight outside, once a welcome sign of life, now felt like an accusing spotlight, casting long, sinister shadows from every desk and every filing cabinet. The air grew heavy, almost viscous, making every breath feel like drawing liquid into my lungs. Then came the sound. It was a soft thud. It came from the cubicle directly next to mine. Mr. Davison, a man known for his meticulous neatness, had just dropped something. My entire body locked up. My muscles seized, turning into solid, unyielding stone. I heard the distinct sound of a pen rolling across the floor. Click-clack, stop. The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched, thin and brittle, for what felt like an eternity. Mr. Davison, a man of precise habits, should have immediately bent down to retrieve his pen. He did not. I felt a cold dread begin to seep into my bones. Why isn't he moving? Is he paralyzed? Or is he, like me, frozen by the fear of looking? Then, after another agonizing stretch of silence, I heard a faint scrape. It was the sound of a shoe being dragged across the carpet, slowly, painstakingly, as if the owner were moving without the use of their legs. My internal monologue was a panicked scramble. Don't look, Elias. Don't you dare look. Keep your eyes on the screen. Keep breathing. You are alone. You are safe. But my mind was battling against a primal curiosity, a horrific fascination with what was happening just inches from my ear. The scraping stopped. It was replaced by a barely audible grunt, a sound of immense effort, followed by another thud. This time, it sounded heavier, more substantial. Did he fall? Is he hurt? Should I look? The impulse to help, a vestige of my old humanity, flickered like a dying ember. But the memory of the woman's cold hand on my chin, the child's mother brutalizing her son in the plaza, the faceless static man behind me, it all surged forward, crushing the impulse. To look was to break the rule. To break the rule was to unleash something. The office remained silent. A new email notification popped up on my screen. It was from Anonymous again. The subject line was just a single word, him. I knew what it meant. I didn't need to open it. Mr. Davison was no longer just Mr. Davison. He was him. He was one of them. The creature from the restroom, the static man behind me, the new entity that now occupied the cubicle next door, they were all connected by this terrible, unspoken network of avoidance. I felt a slight vibration beneath my feet. A rhythmic, subtle tremor. It was the low hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling, but now it sounded different. It had a new rhythm, a faint, pulsing beat that seemed to synchronize with the slow, deliberate click of the desktop clock. My eyes, dry and aching, began to play tricks on me. The pixels on my monitor seemed to writhe, forming fleeting patterns of gray static at the edge of my vision. I felt a growing pressure in my head, a tightness behind my eyes as if my skull were slowly filling with concrete. Then, my cubicle wall began to vibrate. It was faint at first, barely perceptible. A low, continuous thrumming against the flimsy partition. I pressed my palm against the surface. It was cold, yet I could feel a subtle warmth radiating from the other side. A warmth that felt artificial. Is he touching the wall? Is he leaning against it? Or is he becoming the wall? My breath caught in my throat. The air in my cubicle suddenly felt heavy, charged with an invisible energy. The smell of chlorine and stagnant water, which I had only encountered in the restroom, was now faintly present here, mixing with the stale scent of old paper and dust. It was the smell of the transformation. A new email arrived from Anonymous. Subject: see me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pressed delete. I knew what it contained. Another I. Another reflection. Another invitation to a connection that would cost me everything. I heard a faint, rasping sound from Mr. Davison's cubicle. It sounded like someone trying to breathe through a layer of sandpaper. It was not human. It was the sound of something struggling to mimic life, or perhaps the sound of life struggling to mimic something else. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyelids. I was desperate for darkness, for a moment of visual reprieve. But even with my eyes closed, the gray static danced behind my vision, forming vague, indistinct shape. I felt a wave of nausea, a profound disorientation that made me question the very existence of the floor beneath me. They are everywhere, I thought. They are waiting for us to acknowledge them. They are waiting for us to look. I slowly opened my eyes. The office was exactly as it had been. No one looked at each other. Everyone was frozen in their positions, hunched over their desks, their gazes locked onto their screens, their keyboards, their lap. A forest of blind obedience. And I realized, with a cold, horrifying certainty, that the greatest danger was not the thing that had no face. It was the moment when I would finally see it. The afternoon sun had begun its slow, agonizing descent, bleeding a sickly, bruised purple across the office floor. The light didn't feel like a sunset. It felt like a warning lamp casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the carpet like black, oily spills. I sat in my cubicle, my neck stiff and aching, my body a statue of brittle nerve. But it was no longer the silence that was the enemy. It was the sound that began to fill it. It started as a faint, high-frequency hiss, like the sound of a television tuned to a dead channel. It was so subtle at first that I thought it was merely the tinnitus of my own stress, a phantom ringing in my ears. But as the minutes ticked by, the sound grew thicker. It wasn't just in my head, it was in the room. It was vibrating the air, the glass of the windows, the very marrow of my bones. Crackle, hiss, pop. It was the sound of static. But it wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a cadence. It sounded like 1,000 voices whispering at once, their words stripped of vowels, reduced to a dry, papery rustle. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that only made it worse. With my eyes closed, the sound became an image. I could see the gray, shifting particles of the faceless man dancing in the dark, their movements synchronized with the static. Each pop in the noise was a spark of gray light in my mind. I opened my eyes, desperate for the reality of my desk. My hands were shaking so violently now that I had to sit on them to keep from knocking over my coffee mug. The liquid inside the mug was cold, a dark, stagnant pool. I watched its surface. Small, concentric ripples were forming on the water. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Something was walking. Not on the floor. The carpet remained undisturbed. It was walking through the air, or perhaps through the frequency of the room itself. Every step sent a vibration through my desk, a low-frequency thud that I felt more in my stomach than in my ears. I looked at the cubicle wall to my right, the wall separating me from Mr. Davison, or whatever him had become. The gray fabric of the partition was no longer static. It was undulating, moving in a slow, rhythmic wave, as if something were breathing on the other side. Not the wet, gasping breath of a human, but a dry, mechanical suction. SSSHHHH. SSSHHHH. A new sound joined the static. A wet, tearing noise like someone peeling a sticker off a piece of raw meat. It was coming from the hallway. I kept my gaze fixed on my keyboard, but my mind was projecting the scene outside my cubicle. I imagined a colleague, maybe Sarah from accounting or Miller from HR, trying to turn their head, trying to look. I imagined their skin resisting the movement, their muscles tearing as they broke the new laws of physics to catch a glimpse of the void. Elias. The whisper didn't come from the speakers. It didn't come from the hallway. It came from the empty space between my headset and my ear. It was a voice made of crushed glass and static. It was my name, but it sounded like an accusation. Elias, look at the reflection. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, a jagged lump of ice. I realized the voice was right. My computer monitor was dark, the power save mode having finally kicked in. The black glass was now a perfect, dark mirror. In that mirror, I could see the entire office behind me. I saw the rows of cubicles, the hunched forms of my co-workers, their heads bowed like monks in prayer. But they weren't alone. Standing behind every single person was a pillar of gray static. They weren't moving. They were just leaning. They were leaning over the shoulders of the living, their non-faces inches away from the ears of my colleagues, whispering the same static lullaby into their minds. And there was one behind me. It was taller than the others. Its shape was more defined, its edges sharper. I could see the static swirling within its form, like a storm of ash trapped in a jar. It didn't have hands, but it had long, tapering appendages that rested lightly on the back of my chair. I felt the chair move, a tiny, microscopic tilt. "Don't you want to see?" the static whispered. "Don't you want to know what we are?" I stared at the black screen, my vision blurring with tears of pure, unadulterated terror. My internal monologue was a desperate, looping prayer. I am not looking. I am not looking. This is an hallucination. The air is bad. I am tired. I am just tired. But the smell was undeniable. The office now smelled of old electricity, the ozone scent of a lightning strike, mixed with the cloying, sweet rot of something that had been dead a long time. It was the smell of the world being overwritten. Suddenly, the monitor flickered to life. A new email from Anonymous. Subject: the last one. Body: Sarah look. Miller look. Davison is gone. You are the last one in this row who still remembers how to hide. But we can see your eyes in the glass, Elias. We can see them even when you blink. I looked at the reflection of the static man again. It was closer now. Its face was leaning in, its blurred features almost touching the reflection of my own. I could see the static reflecting in the dark pixels of the screen, a digital ghost in a digital machine. I realized then that the rule was failing. Not because people were breaking it, but because the things were becoming too loud to ignore. They were no longer content with being avoided. They wanted the recognition. They wanted the connection. The static in the air reached a deafening crescendo, a screaming white noise that made my ears bleed. I felt a warm, wet trickle down my neck, but I didn't reach up to wipe it away. I just stared at the cursor. Blink. Pause. Blink. Then, the static man reached out. I didn't see it in the mirror. I felt it on my skin. A cold, numbing pressure against my temple. It felt like a block of ice shaped like a finger. "Look at me," it hissed, the voice now coming from inside my own skull. "Look at me and let the static in." I gripped the edge of my desk, my fingernails digging into the wood until they snapped. I wasn't Elias anymore. I was a vessel of resistance, a fortress of closed eyes. But I knew, as the sun finally vanished and the office was plunged into a flickering, artificial twilight, that I couldn't hold out forever. The static was no longer just a sound. It was becoming my heartbeat. The office lights did not simply turn off. They died in a sequence of rhythmic, agonizing spasms. Each fluorescent tube overhead flickered with a violent, violet strobe, casting the room into a series of staccato snapshots. Flash. I saw my hands, pale and trembling, fuse to the edge of the desk. Darkness. The sound of 1,000 paper-thin voices whispering my name. Flash. I saw the person in the cubicle across from me. It was Sarah. Her head was tilted back at an impossible, neck-snapping angle, her jaw unhinged, her eyes wide and staring directly at the ceiling. Darkness. The static was no longer a sound. It was a physical weight. It felt like fine, electrified sand was filling the room, piling up against my skin, entering my nostrils, coating my tongue. Every time I inhaled, I felt the sharp, ozone sting of the signal scratching the inside of my throat. My lungs felt heavy, as if I were breathing in powdered glass. "Keep your eyes down," I whimpered. My voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the screaming white noise of the room. "Don't look up. Just keep looking at the floor." But the floor was changing. In the strobing light, the gray carpet seemed to be liquefying. The synthetic fibers were twisting, braiding themselves into patterns that resembled human faces, distorted, screaming countenances that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. I closed my eyes, but the signal was already inside. Behind my eyelids, I saw a vast, infinite field of gray static, and in the center of that field stood the figure from the mirror. It was no longer behind me. It was everywhere. I felt a cold, phantom pressure on my eyelids. It felt like 2 icy thumbs were pressing down on them, trying to pry them open. I squeezed them shut with such force that colors began to explode in my vision, fractals of red and gold that were quickly swallowed by the encroaching gray. "You are so tired, Elias," the voice hissed. It was a chorus now, a harmony of 100 voices I used to recognize. I heard Henderson's boom, Sarah's laugh, my mother's gentle call, all of them processed through a digital shredder. "Why do you fight the clarity? The static is peaceful. The static is certain. There are no more secrets when no one looks away." I felt my chair begin to spin. Slowly, deliberately. I wasn't moving my legs. The floor wasn't moving. But the chair was rotating on its axis, turning me away from my desk, away from my monitor, and toward the center of the office, toward the open space where the others stood. No. No, no, no. I grabbed the armrests, my knuckles cracking, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I tried to plant my feet, but the floor felt like shifting silt. My heels slid across the carpet as the chair continued its slow, inexorable turn. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of the chair's internal mechanism was the only thing I could hear over the roar of the static. I was now facing the main aisle. Even with my eyes shut, I could feel the presence of the others. I could feel the heat of their bodies, or perhaps the lack of it. They were standing there, a row of silent, upright corpses, their eyes locked onto the space I was about to occupy. "Please," I sobbed, a single hot tear escaping the corner of my eye. "I don't want to see." "But we see you," the chorus replied. The air in front of me suddenly went cold, not the cold of a draft, but the absolute, sucking cold of a vacuum. I felt a hand, the same lavender-scented hand from the train, reach out and touch my forehead. Its touch was like a brand of ice. Then, the fingers moved down. They hooked under my brow. I felt my head being forced up. My neck resisted, the muscles ropey and strained, my chin tucked into my chest until I thought my jaw would break. But the strength of the thing was absolute. It was the strength of a falling mountain, of a rising tide. My head was tilted back. My face was turned toward the center of the room. "Open them," the voices commanded. The strobing lights stopped. The office was plunged into a thick, velvet darkness, broken only by the dim, green glow of the emergency exit sign. In that silence, I heard a sound that broke my heart. It was the sound of 20 people blinking in unison. Wet, soft, rhythmic. I felt the pressure on my eyelids vanish. The fingers were gone. I was alone in the dark, my face tilted toward the void. "I have to open them," I realized. "If I don't open them now, they will never open again." I slowly, agonizingly lifted my lids. At first, there was nothing but the green haze of the exit sign. But as my pupils dilated, the room began to resolve. They were all there. Sarah, Henderson, Miller, Davison. They were standing in a perfect circle around my chair. Their clothes were tattered, their skin pale and shimmering with a faint, oily sheen. And they were all looking at me. But they didn't have eyes. Where their eyes should have been, there were only twin pits of swirling, gray static, tiny, contained storms of ash and light. And as I looked into Davison's eyes, I felt a sudden, violent jolt of recognition. I didn't just see the static. I felt his thoughts. I felt his memories of the morning coffee, his fear of the deadline, his love for a dog that was now starving in an empty apartment. And I felt the static erasing it all, replacing it with a single, unified hum. I tried to look away, but my gaze was locked. The connection was forged. A bridge of gray light snapped into existence between my eyes and theirs. I felt my own vision beginning to flicker. The green exit sign started to break apart into pixels. The walls of the office began to dissolve into a fine, gray mist. I looked down at my hands and I saw through them. I could see the floorboards, then the pipes, then the dark earth beneath the building. I wasn't dying. I was being tuned. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Only a cloud of gray static, which drifted into the air and joined the storm. I realized then that the anonymous sender was right. I was the last one, and now the row was complete. The office did not end with a bang, nor did it vanish into a void. It simply became transparent. As the bridge of gray light solidified between my eyes and the static pits of my former colleagues, the physical world began to lose its density. I looked at Sarah, but I no longer saw the fabric of her blouse or the desperate lines on her face. I saw the frequency of her being. She was a vibration, a series of jagged electrical pulses that were slowly smoothing out, becoming a single, flat line of gray noise. The walls of the cubicles bled into the floor. The ceiling tiles drifted away like ash. I looked out the window and I saw that Oakhaven was gone. The skyline was no longer made of steel and glass. It was a forest of flickering pillars reaching into a sky the color of a dead television screen. There were no cars, no lights, no movement. Only billions of tiny, gray particles dancing in a silent, cosmic wind. I felt my heart give one last, heavy thud. It was a primitive sound, a relic of a biological machine that was no longer required. My pulse didn't stop, it transformed. It became a steady, high-pitched hum that resonated with the hum of the person next to me and the person next to them. "Welcome," the chorus whispered. This time, the voice didn't come from my ears or my mind. It was the air itself. It was the vibration of my own atoms. The recognition is complete. There is no more you. There is only the signal. I tried to remember my name. Elias. The word felt foreign, a clunky piece of discarded metadata. I tried to remember the taste of coffee, the smell of rain, the feeling of a hand that wasn't cold. But the memories were being overwritten by the static. Each memory was a glitch in the system, a piece of noise that the signal was diligently smoothing over. I watched as my own hands, once solid, once capable of holding a briefcase or a pen, dissolved into a mist of gray pixels. I wasn't falling. I was expanding. I was becoming the floor, the air, the discarded coffee stain, and the empty chair. I looked at the others in the circle. They were no longer Sarah or Henderson. They were nodes, points of connection in a vast, infinite network of staring eyes. The rule was dead. We looked at each other now. We looked at everything. We saw through the walls of the neighboring buildings, through the asphalt of the streets, through the very crust of the earth. We saw millions of others, all standing in their own circles, their eyes wide and swirling with the same gray storm. There was no more fear, because there was no more mystery. There was no more loneliness, because there was no more self to be alone. I realized then that this was the destiny of the city. We had spent our lives avoiding each other's gazes, building walls of politeness and towers of isolation. We had created a world so fragmented that the universe finally stepped in to mend the crack. It had replaced our messy, individual lives with a single, perfect frequency. A final flash of light erupted, not from the ceiling, but from within us. The gray static turned a blinding, brilliant white. For a split second, I saw the world as it truly was, a complex web of light and energy, beautiful and terrifyingly vast. And then, the white noise took over. The sound was a roar that became a whisper, that became a sigh, that became nothing. The office at 142nd Street is empty now. The monitors are dark. The chairs are neatly tucked under the desk. If a janitor were to walk in, he would find no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood, no evidence that 20 people had ever been there. But if he were to stop for a moment, if he were to stand in the center of the aisle and close his eyes, he would hear it, a faint, high-frequency hiss, a dry, papery rustle, and if he were brave enough, or foolish enough, to look into the reflection of a dark window, he might see a figure standing right behind him. A figure made of shifting, gray static, waiting for him to break the rule. Waiting for him to look, because the signal is always looking for a new node. And the city is very, very quiet.